For years, cruiser buyers were told what they were supposed to want. Bigger engines, more electronics, higher prices, more attitude, more everything. But somewhere along the way, more stopped feeling like progress and started feeling like weight. Indian Motorcycle is winning attention because it speaks to that frustration. It gives riders enough tradition to respect, enough modern engineering to trust, and enough real-world comfort to make the usual choices feel less automatic. That does not mean Indian is perfect. Serious riders know better than that. But watch till the end, because the real reason riders are buying Indian says less about hype and more about what the rest of the industry forgot. Something doesn't add up anymore. Walk into enough dealerships right now and you start seeing the same thing without anyone needing to explain it. Bikes are sitting longer, not junk, not outdated machines. Good bikes, well built, with strong reputations, still sitting. You hear the same conversations repeating across the floor, people asking more questions than they used to. Not about horsepower, not about features, about what it actually takes to live with the bike once it leaves the showroom. It is not about one brand doing something dramatic. It is not about a single model suddenly changing the game. The shift is quieter than that. It is happening across the entire floor. Certain bikes draw attention, but they do not close. Others get less talk, but end up leaving with someone at the end of the day. That gap between interest and commitment is where everything changed. And right in the middle of that hesitation, one thing stands out. When riders look at certain Indian models, that pause shortens. The questions are still there, but they do not carry the same weight. Decisions come easier, not faster out of impulse, but clearer, like something finally lines up again. That is where the real story begins, because hesitation never appears on its own. It builds from something deeper that riders started feeling long before they stepped into a dealership. The moment more stopped working. For years, the direction was clear. Bigger engines, more power, more technology, higher price tags. That was supposed to be the path forward. The assumption was simple. If you gave riders more, they would always want more. That logic held for a long time, until it didn't. You can see the break when riders stop reacting the way they used to. Machines that would have drawn a crowd a few years ago now get a glance and a quick walk past. Not because they are bad, because they stopped making sense in real use. The performance is there, no question. The engineering is impressive. But the connection between what is offered and what is actually needed started to slip. That disconnect shows up in quiet ways. Riders are no longer asking how fast something is. They are asking how it feels in traffic. They are not asking how advanced the electronics are. They are asking how much attention the bike demands over time. The priorities shifted without the industry catching it. And that is where Indian did something different without making a big announcement about it. It did not chase the extremes. It stayed in a range that fits how people actually ride, not how machines are marketed. That difference is small on paper, but it shows up immediately when decisions get real. Once that expectation breaks, the next thing riders notice is not price. It is how the machine meets them physically the moment they get on it. If this breakdown is hitting close to what you're seeing out there, hit like, subscribe, and share your experience below. Real rider insight matters more than any sales pitch, and your input helps others make smarter decisions before committing to the wrong machine. When bikes stopped meeting you. Halfway. You do not feel weight on a spec sheet. You feel it the second you pull a bike off the stand. You feel it when you come to a stop on uneven pavement. You feel it backing into a tight space where there is no room for mistakes. That is where a lot of modern machines started losing people. Seat height is another one that never sounds like a problem until it is. Confidence at a stop matters more than anything written in a brochure. Balance matters more than peak performance. The way a bike settles under you at low speed says more about its usability than anything it does at high speed. In real traffic, none of the extreme capability matters if the bike asks more from you than you are willing to give every mile. Tight turns, stop and go movement, uneven roads. That is where the experience either works or it does not. And for a lot of riders, the gap between what the machine can do and what it demands started getting wider. That is where bikes like the Indian Chief stand out without trying to. They feel planted, predictable, not light in a fragile way, but stable in a way that works with you instead of against you. That difference reduces effort, and effort adds up faster than most people admit. Once the ride itself starts asking more than it gives back, the next layer shows up after the engine shuts off. When ownership started asking too much, it used to be straightforward. You rode the bike, you maintained it, and you kept going. You knew what needed attention and when. That rhythm made ownership feel natural. That changed when systems started stacking on top of each other. Maintenance is no longer just maintenance. It is scheduling, diagnostics, waiting for availability. You are not just dealing with parts, you are dealing with systems that require tools and processes you do not control. That adds a layer of dependency that was not always there. Electronics brought another shift: sensors, updates, calibration. Things you cannot see, cannot adjust, and often cannot diagnose without going through a dealer. That changes how problems are handled. What used to be a fix becomes a process, and processes take time. Time becomes the real cost. Waiting on parts, waiting on service windows, planning around the bike instead of the bike fitting into your time. That is where ownership starts to feel like work. Not because the machine is unreliable, but because everything around it became heavier. Indian did not remove modern systems, but it kept the ownership cycle manageable. Fewer surprises, more predictability. You know what you are dealing with, and that matters more than anything extra the bike could offer. When ownership stops feeling natural, riders do not quit. They start looking for something that fits back into place. What dealers are actually seeing. Spend enough time around dealership floors and the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Inventory is not moving evenly. Certain brands are sitting past the 90-day mark, sometimes longer, even when incentives are on the table. At the same time, specific Indian models are moving through faster than expected. Not instantly, not in a rush, but steadily, without needing heavy discounts to push them out the door. That difference matters because it shows what buyers are actually doing, not what marketing says they should be doing. Conversations are changing. Instead of chasing the newest release, riders are asking about what others are keeping. Sales staff are noticing the same thing repeated. Customers coming back after looking elsewhere, not because they were convinced, but because nothing else settled the same way. Repeat buyers are part of the shift as well. Not just people entering the brand for the first time, but riders returning for another Indian after living with one. That kind of behavior does not come from hype, it builds from experience. When someone goes through a full ownership cycle and decides to stay, that signals something different than a first impression. The movement is not sudden. There are no sharp spikes that suggest a temporary surge. Instead, the pattern holds across months. Units move at a steady pace. Demand builds without noise. That consistency is what separates a trend from a correction. It shows alignment between what is being built and what riders are actually willing to live with. Look closely at those patterns, and one thing becomes clear. This did not happen by accident. It points back to decisions made long before the bikes reached the showroom. The rebuild that fixed the foundation. The turning point did not come from styling or marketing. It came from structure. When Polaris Inc. took control, the focus shifted toward rebuilding the foundation instead of chasing attention. Production processes were tightened. Quality control systems were reinforced at every stage. Components that once failed under regular use were redesigned with durability in mind. Engines played a central role in that shift. Platforms like the Thunderstroke 111 were built to deliver consistent performance over long miles, not just strong numbers on paper. Cooling behavior, vibration control, and internal tolerances were refined to support real-world riding conditions. These were not dramatic changes introduced all at once. They were incremental corrections applied over multiple production cycles. What stands out is the focus on stability. Instead of releasing constant variations, development stayed within controlled boundaries. Fewer radical changes meant fewer new problems. Each generation built on what was already working rather than replacing it entirely. That approach reduced unpredictability, which is what riders notice over time. Problems did not disappear overnight. Early issues were addressed step by step, with feedback loops between riders and production tightening the response time. Complaints that once repeated across model years started to drop. That pattern shift is what rebuilds confidence. Not perfection, but direction. That kind of foundation does more than improve reliability. It changes how a bike is perceived before it is even ridden. Once that base is stable, the next difference shows up in how long riders choose to stay with what they bought. The bike you don't have to replace. There is a noticeable change in how often riders are switching bikes. The cycle of buying, riding briefly, and trading up has slowed in certain segments. Instead, more owners are keeping what they have for longer periods. That behavior says more than any advertisement. It shows that the machine continues to meet expectations after the initial excitement fades. With Indian, that pattern shows up in ownership timelines. Riders are not rushing to replace their bikes after a season or two. They are putting miles on them, adjusting to them, and staying with them. That stability reduces the pressure to constantly look for the next option. It shifts the mindset from temporary use to long-term ownership. Fewer surprises play a role in that decision. When maintenance follows a predictable pattern and performance remains consistent, the need to reconsider the purchase disappears. The bike becomes something you rely on, not something you evaluate after every ride. That difference changes how decisions are made at the start. The buying process itself begins to feel more final, not in the sense of being locked in, but in the sense that the choice does not need to be revisited immediately. That removes a layer of uncertainty that often pushes riders toward early upgrades. Confidence in the machine extends the ownership cycle naturally. That extended relationship with the bike creates a different kind of value. It is not measured in features or specifications. It shows up in how the ride feels over time, something that becomes clear only after the miles start to add up. The part you can't measure on paper. There is a point during a ride where numbers stop mattering. It happens when the bike settles into a rhythm that does not need explanation. The engine pulse becomes steady. The response to input becomes predictable. You are no longer thinking about what the machine is doing because you can feel it directly. That connection is not about raw performance. It is about feedback. Modern systems often smooth everything out to the point where the experience becomes distant. With Indian, the feedback remains present. Not rough, not uncontrolled, but noticeable. Each input carries a response that is easy to recognize and adjust to. The difference shows up over time. The longer the ride, the more that connection matters. Instead of managing the bike, you move with it. That reduces the effort required to stay engaged. The experience becomes consistent rather than variable, which is what allows riders to stay on the road longer without fatigue setting in. It also changes how the machine is remembered after the ride ends, not as a collection of features, but as a single experience that felt natural from start to finish. That kind of impression builds slowly, but it stays longer than any initial excitement. Once that connection is established, it reinforces everything else. Reliability, ownership, and usability all carry more weight when the ride itself feels right. That is what keeps riders from looking elsewhere, even when other options promise more on paper. Nothing between you and the ride. There is a difference you feel the moment the road demands a response. Throttle input connects directly, not filtered through layers of correction or delay. Braking feels immediate, predictable, and tied to what your hands are doing, not what a system decides to adjust behind the scenes. That direct connection changes how the ride unfolds, especially when conditions shift quickly. Modern machines often insert layers between the rider and the outcome. Traction control, ride modes, and adaptive systems all have their place, but they can create a gap between input and response. You twist the throttle, and something else interprets it before the bike reacts. Over time, that adds a level of uncertainty, not in safety, but in feel. With Indian, that gap narrows. Input becomes output with less interpretation. The throttle opens, the engine responds, and the bike moves in a way that matches expectation. The same applies to braking and cornering behavior. There is less negotiation with unseen systems, and more reliance on what you feel directly through the bars, the seat, and the frame. That clarity reduces mental load. You are not second-guessing what the bike might be doing. You are focused on the road, the line, and the timing. Control becomes something you maintain, not something you share. That difference may seem small at first, but it builds with every mile. When control feels natural again, the experience becomes easier to trust. And once that trust is there, it opens the door for a different kind of rider to step into the same space. If you want more straight, no-nonsense breakdowns like this, subscribe now. Every video here is built to cut through the hype, show what actually matters, and help you stay ahead of decisions that affect your ride and your money long-term. A different kind of new rider. A noticeable change is happening with the people entering the market. New riders are not arriving with the same expectations that shaped earlier generations. They are not focused on proving anything through speed or performance. Instead, they are looking for something that fits into their lives without creating pressure. Manageability has become a deciding factor. Bikes that feel approachable, both physically and mentally, draw more attention than machines that demand immediate mastery. The learning curve matters. Riders want something that allows them to build confidence over time, not something that challenges them from the first mile. Indian fits into that space in a way that does not require explanation. The power delivery is predictable. The ergonomics are accessible. The overall experience does not overwhelm. That combination lowers the barrier to entry without stripping away what makes the ride engaging. What stands out is that riders are not leaving once they enter, staying instead of moving to something larger, creating overlap between newer riders and those with decades of experience. And when generations meet there, something forms beyond the product itself. The culture that builds itself. Look at where these bikes gather, and a pattern emerges. Parking lots, roadside stops, group rides. The same models appear again and again, but the riders are not identical. Different backgrounds, different riding histories, yet a shared approach to what matters on the road. The tone is different from what you might expect. There is less emphasis on comparison and more on recognition. Instead of measuring one bike against another, the focus shifts toward shared experience. Conversations revolve around miles ridden, routes taken, and what works over time. That environment does not come from marketing. It builds from repeated interactions. Riders who find something that fits tend to stay connected to others who made the same choice. Group rides grow, events take shape. The brand becomes a common point of reference rather than a status marker. Ownership starts to extend beyond the machine. It becomes participation, showing up, riding together, sharing what works and what does not. That kind of culture reinforces itself. New riders step into it and feel the difference immediately. Experienced riders recognize something familiar in how it operates. That connection holds only if the machines continue to support it. Without consistency, the structure falls apart. Which brings everything back to one question that never fully disappears. Trust didn't come back overnight. The past is still part of the conversation. Riders who have been around long enough remember the problems that once defined the brand. Oil leaks, electrical issues, inconsistent build quality. Those experiences do not fade quickly, and they should not. They set the baseline for how trust is measured. What changed is not the memory, but the pattern that followed. Improvements came gradually, not as a single breakthrough. Each model year addressed specific issues. Feedback from riders translated into adjustments in production and design. Over time, recurring problems became less common. The difference shows up in how often complaints repeat. Where issues once appeared across multiple cycles, they now surface less frequently and are addressed more directly. That shift does not create instant confidence, but it creates direction. And direction matters more than perfection. As that trust returns, the focus moves away from what might go wrong and toward how far the platform can go. That shift signals that the foundation is no longer in question, and that changes how riders think about what comes next. When scale starts to matter, there comes a point where growth stops being about momentum and starts being about structure. That is where things begin to change in a way you can actually feel as a rider. Production expands, not just in numbers, but in consistency. More units moving through the same system means fewer surprises, tighter tolerances, and a clearer pattern in how these machines behave over time. Dealer networks begin to stretch wider, not in a scattered way, but in a way that supports ownership across different regions. You are not guessing where your next service will come from. You are not wondering if parts will take weeks to arrive. Availability improves because the system behind the bike has been built to handle volume, not just demand. Parts flow more predictably. Service timelines shorten because the infrastructure is no longer catching up. It is operating at a level where it can support what is already on the road. That stability shows up quietly, but it changes everything about long-term ownership. The bike becomes part of your routine instead of something that interrupts it. When scale reaches that level, it is no longer about growth for its own sake. It becomes about supporting the rider in a way that removes uncertainty. And once that uncertainty is gone, the impact spreads outward to everything else sharing the same market. The pressure on everyone else. As that stability takes hold, it does not stay isolated. It creates pressure in places that were not prepared for it. Other brands begin to feel the shift, not through headlines, but through movement on the floor. Inventory starts to linger longer than expected. Incentives increase, not as a strategy, but as a response. Pricing adjustments begin to appear, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. The gap between what is offered and what riders are willing to pay becomes harder to ignore. That gap forces changes in lineup decisions. More attention shifts toward machines that sit closer to real-world use instead of pushing further into extremes. Dealers feel it first. Slower movement changes how they present bikes, how they talk to customers, and how they manage what is already sitting in the showroom. Conversations shift away from selling features and toward addressing concerns that were not part of the process before. That pressure does not come from aggressive expansion or loud messaging. It comes from alignment. And when alignment exposes imbalance elsewhere, the deeper issue begins to surface. Where the industry drifted. The path that led here was not sudden. It was built over years of small decisions that made sense at the time. Focus moved toward specifications, toward measurable gains, toward margins that justified continued development. Each step followed a logic that pointed forward, but not necessarily toward the rider. Real-world usability began to take a secondary role. Not ignored, but overshadowed. Machines were designed to excel in areas that looked strong on paper. Performance increased, features multiplied, and complexity followed naturally. The assumption was that riders would adapt, as they always had. For a long time, they did. They adjusted to higher weight, more systems, and increased cost, because the experience still held together. But adaptation has limits. When enough small shifts move in the same direction, they begin to add up in ways that are hard to ignore. Eventually, the balance tipped. Riders stopped adjusting without thinking. They started noticing what had changed, not in one moment, but across many rides. The connection between what was built and what was needed began to weaken. Once that space opened, it did not need to be forced. It was filled naturally by what already aligned with those expectations. The real reason this isn't a trend, When you step back and look at the full picture, it stops looking like a sudden rise. It starts to look like a correction that has been building quietly for years. This is not about one brand outperforming others in a traditional sense. It is about alignment, returning to the center of the experience. Riders are not chasing something new. They are moving toward what fits again. That shift changes how decisions are made, how bikes are compared, and how ownership is defined. Balance becomes more important than excess. Consistency matters more than peak capability. The change did not happen overnight. It developed gradually, through small adjustments that eventually reached a point where they could no longer be ignored. What feels like a sudden movement is actually the result of time catching up with reality. Once that alignment is recognized, it becomes difficult to unsee. The hesitation fades, not because something new appeared, but because something familiar returned to a place where it works again. So, the real reason everyone is looking at Indian is not hype, it is frustration. Riders are tired of bikes that look impressive in the showroom, but feel heavier, hotter, costlier, and more complicated once real ownership begins. Indian stepped into that gap with something that feels familiar, usable, and honest enough to make people look twice. Now I want to hear from you. Hit like, subscribe for more no-nonsense motorcycle breakdowns, and comment below, is Indian truly earning this attention, or is the industry just making it easier for them?